Meet the artist Jennifer Strunge. She's the creator behind something she calls Cotton Monster. Monsters that you can see and even wear. That's right. These wearable works of art are created by Jennifer. She's been sewing since she was a little girl, creating dolls and puppets. In college, she began creating these monsters, and she still does it today. She uses recycled clothing, sometimes stitching by hand and by machine to make her masterpieces that you can wear and enjoy as fabulous works of art. She's our inspiration for the monsters that we are going to create. That's right, we're making our own stuffed monsters. So you need to be thinking about what kind of expression you'd like your hand-sewn monster to have. I'm so excited to see what you come up with. Let's get started. The first step to making your own stuffed creature is to first pick out your fabric you want to use. So decide what color you want your monster to be. Once you've got that figured out, you'll also need to figure out what color you want the arms and the legs to be. So I'll move these finished monsters out of the way. I've already picked out my fabric. Now you'll need two pieces of fabric, one for the front of the monster and another for the back. Once you have those two pieces of fabric, you'll also need to get 4 small pieces of fabric, 2 for the arms and 2 for the legs. Before you begin sewing, the first thing you'll need to do is work with these smaller pieces of fabric. So I want my monster to have fingers and toes. So I know I want these two to be the same. These are for the arms, and these two to be the same. They are for the legs. So I'm going to go ahead and stack them, and I can cut them both at the same time, or I can cut them separately. If I cut them at the same time, it might be a little bit tricky because I'm cutting through something thick like felt. So I'm just going to see how this goes, and I'm going to make angle line cuts. I'm going to cut a diagonal, take my scissors out, cut another diagonal, and now I have an angle right there. And I'll do the same thing right here. There. I'm going to move those out of the way. I can maybe use them for something later. And on this one, I think I'll cut it one at a time. This time, instead of doing a zigzag line, I'll do what's called a scallop. So I'm going to cut a curve, and notice that my scissors never move. It's my hand that's holding the fabric that does all the rotating, and that really helps me to get the lines that I want. I'm also opening and closing my scissors very slowly. Perfect. That might be a fun eyebrow later when I go to make the face, so I'll definitely save that. I'm saving all of my scraps because I can really do something fun with them later. Once you have your toes and your fingers cut out for your monster, then you're ready to get your monster ready for sewing. So I'm going to go ahead and separate my 2 pieces of fabric just like this. And this part, listen very carefully because it's going to sound very unusual what we're about to do. You want your monster's arms and legs to appear like this. I want my monster's arms and legs to be sparkly side up. So notice I have all of them so they're sparkly. If your fabric doesn't have a sparkle and it's the same on both sides, you won't have to worry about it. I'm now that I have this where I want it to go, this is how I want my monster to appear, I'm now going to turn everything inward. And I want this edge to be matched up with the edge of the monster. And I'm also placing it about in the middle. So I'm going to flip this one inward, this edge matching with this one, getting it about in the middle. Same here, so it looks like my monster has his 2 hands together. Flipping both of these. Now they both can't be in the middle, so I will put them evenly spaced, making sure the bottom edge matches once again. So this is what your monster should look like when you're getting ready to stitch. And now that I've got that, I'll take this other piece of fabric and I'm going to lay it right on top. And the great thing about the fabric is that you can see through it, making sure we don't have anything sticking out. So now I'm going to sew the sides and I'm going to sew the bottom. But when I sew, everything is going to move around on me a little bit. So what people who are sewing use to keep things from moving around are pins. So I'm going to use a pin, and that pin is going to help hold things in place for me. Be careful because the pin is sharp on one end. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this, and I know that I need this to stay still. So look carefully how I'm going to use this pin. I'm pushing it into the fabric. I'm not just pushing it into one piece. This helping hand of mine is going to pinch and grab all of this, the whole thing, and it's lifting it up, and my pin is going to go in the fabric all the way, and then I'm pushing it back out. And that's going to hold this whole thing in place as I stitch. I'm going to go ahead and rotate or turn this. I'm going to do this 4 times. Once, twice, 3, 4. So I'm sticking my pin in. Before I do, I'm going to make sure I have all of my fabric. Push it in, poke it out. Pinch and grab all the fabric, in, out, and one more time. In, and then out. And now what this does is this makes it so when I pick up my stitching, nothing falls out. It's all going to stay in place when I sew. So now that you're ready to sew, you're going to use 3 things. Your needle, you'll have thread, and a little piece of paper that we're going to call your needle threader. So let's take a look at this needle before we get started. It's very sharp on one end, so you'll need to be careful. And at the top of the needle, there's a little bitty opening, and that's called the eye of the needle. What you need to do is thread the needle or get the thread inside the eye of the needle, but that can be very tricky because the eye is small and the thread is a little bit big. So that's why we're going to use a needle threader. This needle threader is just a little piece of paper that's been folded in half so it looks a little bit like a hot dog. You'll open up this hot dog piece of paper, take the end of your thread like a hot dog, a really long hot dog, and close your needle threader, making sure there's no thread sticking out of the end. So I'll just back that up a little bit. There we go. And now that I've got the thread inside of here, I'm going to pinch it really tightly and then stick it in that eye of the needle, just like that. Pull it all the way through, and now my needle is threaded. Now that that's finished, I'm going to go ahead and pull the thread through the needle, and what I need to do is match up the ends of the thread. So I'm finding both ends of my thread, matching them up just like this. Get my needle all nice and straight. There we go. Now that I have that done, I'm going to need to put excuse me, a knot right here at the end of my thread. So to do that, I've got both ends together. I'll make an O. Take the tails, put them in the O. So I wrap them around the back and put them in the O and pull. And now I have a knot. I'll do that one more time just so you can see. Make an O. Take the tails, put them in the O, and pull until I have a knot. Okay, I'm finished, and now I'm ready to sew. So I have my monster back out, still pinned in place, and like I said earlier, we're going to stitch the sides and the bottom. We are not going to sew the top yet. That's going to be the thing we do last. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this side. I will start here and end here, and then what I need to do is get more thread, start here and there, get more thread, start here and there, and I'm finished for now until we work at the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the back, and I'm doing something called a whip stitch. So my needle needs to go through both pieces of fabric, not just one. So I'm holding it with one hand, but I'm watching my fingers because, like I said, this needle is sharp. You really need to keep your eyes on what you're doing. So my needle just went through the back, and it's going through both pieces of fabric, and I'm going to pull the needle until this knot stops the needle. I'll show you. So I'm pulling, 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 and then the knot, I can't pull it anymore because the knot is there and it's acting like an anchor and it's making it so I can't pull anymore. Now what I'm going to do is go around. This is called a whip stitch. When I do use a whip stitch, my needle is always coming up and going around and coming up and going around. And I need to keep my stitches pretty close together. If I have them far apart, stuffing will come out. So I'm going to have my needle, it always pokes up. It's close to my other one, and it's still close to the edge. Pull it until it stops. There we go. Now, do you see how the fabric pulled in a little bit? If I don't like the way that looks, I can just gently pull that back out. All that means is I just pulled a little too tightly. If I don't want it puckered in like that, I can just pull it back out. So now my needle is out, up, pull, around. This part now I have to go through not only both the front and the back of the fabric, but I also have to go through that little arm. So that's more fabric for me to push my needle through. So I have to push a little bit firmly around. Remember, your needle always pokes up, around, up, around. And I'm doing this a couple of times, especially where my arm is, because I don't want the arm to come out. Making sure I'm going through both the front and the back of the fabric. I'm going slowly and checking as I go. My stitches are pretty close together. Up, around, and I'm almost to the end. When I get to the end, I'll need to anchor it once more, making sure that my thread doesn't come out. So now I think I'll do one more stitch. I'm at the end. Now, if I just cut the thread right here, what would happen is that my stitches would eventually unravel and come out and my stuffed creature would fall apart. So I have to anchor the beginning and the end. But the way that I do this knot is a little different. So I'm going to pretend, to make this knot, I have to pretend that this is an airplane. So my airplane is going to the airport, and when it lands at the airport, it picks up a stitch. So it's picking up the last stitch, the one that it's closest to. And as the airplane is taking off, it realizes, oh, it forgot to pick up a passenger. It forgot to pick up the loop. So it does a U-turn in the sky, turns around, picks up the loop, and now it can take off. And I like to do that 2 times. Notice my fingers are holding it down flat so that it doesn't do this when I'm doing it. So I'll do that one more time. Here's my airplane. It's picking up a stitch. It's taking off. As it's flying away, it realizes it forgot a passenger, so it's doing a U-turn. Notice my fingers holding it so my little loop doesn't get too small. My airplane comes back, picks up the loop. I did that twice. And now I have a knot that's anchored this end right here. So I can go ahead and snip. And now I have to do the exact same thing once and twice just to make sure that I have both the sides and the bottom stitch. Now that I'm finished and I have sewn the sides and the bottom, I'm ready to go ahead and take out my pins, making sure that I collect all four and put all four back. Since they are sharp, we don't want to leave any pins out. And now I'm going to flip my stitching inside out, just like I was flipping inside out a shirt or a pillow or a sock. Flip it inside out and let's see if my monster turned out correctly. So if you stitched correctly, pinned correctly, you should have a monster that looks a little bit like that. So I did it correctly. I've got my 2 arms and I've got my 2 legs. And now I'm ready to start working on how I want my monster's face to look. Now that I'm all done sewing my monster, I am ready to go ahead and work on the face. And I'm going to be using scrap pieces of felt to create the parts of the face. And I'm going to be gluing those parts of the face to the monster. I don't want to accidentally, however, when I'm adding those glued pieces, accidentally glue my monster closed. I don't want the glue to soak through this thin fabric and close my monster. So for that reason, I'm going to slide a piece of paper inside. This is only going to stay for a little while, just long enough for me to get those pieces glued onto my face, and I will take it out before I stitch my monster closed. So now that that's in there, it's a good idea to go ahead and sketch out some ideas of what you want your monster's face to look like. Do you want it to have 2 eyes? Do you want it to have 1 eye? Could it have a heart shape for a pupil? Could it have a big open mouth? So think about some different ideas you might want your monster to have before you go ahead and start working. The first thing I always like to work on are the eyeballs. So for that, I'm going to use, I don't think pink would show up very well on pink. So what I think I will use is maybe a light blue. I'm going to use this for my eyes. And I know that I need 2 circles. I'm going to actually use a slightly bigger piece. And I'm going to use a template. A template is something to trace. So I know that I don't want my monster to have 1 eye. So I'll go ahead and notice that I put this really close to the edge so that I don't waste felt. Even if you're using a scrap piece, we don't want to waste any of the felt. So use as little as you can, get it as close to the edge as you can so that you don't use up too much. So I'm tracing 2 because I know I want my monster to have 2 eyes. Now when you're cutting the felt, it's not easy to cut because you're cutting a piece of fabric. So to make sure that you cut all the way through that fabric, what I always like to do is cut out a large piece of the fabric first. Just get all this extra stuff out of the way. And I'm holding it like this, kind of holding it between my fingers to kind of hold it flat since it's fabric and it likes to move. Also, if you open your scissors wide and use the inside part of your scissors, you can get more leverage. So I'm going to go ahead and push the fabric all the way back to the back of the scissors. Now those teeny tiny pieces of felt, we might not be able to use those for much. So I've got 1 eye cut out and another. Now once I've got my eyes cut out, I'm not just going to start gluing things down, because what if I change my mind as I'm working? So I'm just going to set it on my monster where I think I might want it to go. If I see lines where I was tracing, I don't like the way that looks, so I'm going to flip that over and have that be the back. I could have a 1-eyed monster. I could have monster with 2 eyes side by side, or maybe 1 up, 1 down. So that's why it's kind of fun to play with a little bit before you start gluing. Now that I have that finished, I've got the eyeball, but eyes have 3 parts. They have the eyeball, they have the colorful part, which is called the iris, and they have the small little black dot, which is called the pupil. You don't have to use those colors, but you probably will want several parts of the eye to make them look more like eyes. So now that I've got this finished, I'm going to go ahead and use a different piece of fabric, like this scrap piece, and I only need a small piece, and I'm going to make the pupil. Now the pupil is not as big as the eyeball. I'm sorry, making the iris. The iris is not as big as the eyeball, but it's also not as tiny as the pupil. This fabric's going to be a little tricky for me to draw on, so I think I will do something called drawing with scissors. That's something that you can do also. You don't always have to draw on the fabric first. I'm going to cut out a good amount of this. Now that I've got that done, trying to turn the fabric as I go. That way I create a circle. There's one. And now I want the other one to be about the same size. That might be a little tricky. So I'll turn this fabric as I go to try to get them to be about the same. Close enough for me. Now that I'm done with that, I can work on the pupil. Now my irises are very dark in color, so using another dark color on that might not allow them to show up because these are what's called the same value. So maybe I could use something totally different, something bright that will stand out. And these are a lot smaller, so I don't have to use as much fabric. And I can draw on here, or I can do my drawing with scissors trick. There we go. Now, here's something else you can do to your eyes. You could, of course, add eyelashes, but everything you're adding with additional felt. We're not drawing on here. We're adding it with the felt. So I could add little scrap pieces of eyelashes like this blue that I have cut out. Could just snip some of those off. And that could be glued down right now, though I'm just placing it because I'm trying to decide if that's something I want to do. So I have all these cool little scraps that could be used for eyelashes. What I like to do, though, is create an eyelid. An eyelid is what covers your eye. And that's really simple to do because all you do is you take one of your circles and you're going to make another circle the same size. Let me get it as close to the edge as possible. I could hold it on here. I could trace it on here. There's a lot of different ways for you to get your felt cut out. It's just a little bit of experimenting. All right, now that I've got this finished, go ahead and put this back on there. To create the eyelid, I'm just going to cut this circle right in half. And now I have an eyelid, which if you play with the eyelids a little bit, you can really have a monster that's showing different emotions. So now he's a little bit more surprised. Here he was looking pretty sleepy. If I angle them in, suddenly he's looking a little bit angry. If I angle the eyes out, he looks a little sad. So you can really play around with the emotions that your monster's having. You could even move your irises around. If he's a silly monster, maybe his eyes are crossed. Or maybe he's looking in a different direction. So it's a lot of fun playing around to see what you want your monster to be doing. I think I'll have my monster. I liked it really when it was silly like this. Now, once you've got that done, you can work on something like the mouth. So again, it might help to check your sketch, see what you want to do, see what the shapes are already doing. You can't have shapes hanging off, but this is a pretty good shape right here. Oh, by the way, we were talking about eyelashes. If you then want to go back and add eyelashes, I think I might do that with this, just using some of my scraps, add some eyelashes like that too. Maybe just 3 here and some there. For the mouth, I could draw it on here first. I think that shape was pretty good, but I didn't like how big it was. I'm going to trim it down a little bit. It's all about experimenting and trying. If you set it on there and you don't like it, or if it's still too big, you know that you can just take your scissors and change it. Don't ever just throw your fabric away because somebody might want to use it. I'm going to cut a little V right here. And now I'm just going to experiment with some different things for my monster. that you've glued all the parts of your monster down, it's time to go ahead and take this piece of paper out. If it sticks a little bit because the glue soaked through, just gently pull it off and then go ahead and take that out. And now we're really close to being done with our stuffed monster. Today, what we need to do is make it stuffed, give it some form, and then we're going to have to seal it closed by stitching the top. So you'll be using some cotton batting to fill and stuff your monster. If you don't have cotton batting, you could easily use paper that you've cut into strips or shredded it. You could also use even some recycled felt that you used to create your monster. Basically, anything that feels kind of soft, has a soft texture, would be perfect for filling your monster. Your goal is to make it so that the whole thing is filled, especially those corners. So what I'm going to do is not take tons right away. I just kind of pulled some off. And I'm sticking it inside the corners. I'm starting at the bottom, using my fingers to push it into the corners, starting by pushing it all the way down to the bottom. And if you see parts of your monster that didn't quite get glued, once the whole thing is stuffed and stitched back together, then what you can do is put a little dot of glue and press those parts down. And go ahead and get this other corner. Really pushing the batting into those corners. That'll make it nice and stuffed. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and start smushing it down to fill in the middle. And I kind of want to overstuff it just a little bit, but I want to keep the top part flat, because this is where we're going to need to stitch it, so it needs to be able to stay together. It looks like I could add a little bit more before I start to stitch. Okay, now when I'm stitching, just like before, it's going to help if I have a couple of pins to hold it in place. I'm going to push the stuffing as far down as it will go to kind of create a flat top right there across the top. And I'm going to add just a couple of pins, because if I were to try to stitch it right now, you see it just wants to hang open. So I'm going to push this down. I'll put a pin right in the middle, pitching both the front and the back of the fabric. Push the pin in, poke the pin out. And if it helps to have a friend hold this for you, that might be really helpful to keep both pieces of fabric together as you pin. I'm going to just put 3 pins. Watch out, you remember it's sharp. And maybe put one right here. And I'm doing the same stitch that I did before, so I have just like before. I'll be starting at one end, going through both pieces of fabric, and taking my stitch around. Now, this stitch is going to be visible. I don't know if you noticed, but your other stitches are hidden on the inside of your stuffed monster. These are going to be exposed. So I like to think of this as kind of like the hair for my monster. That being said, though, I definitely want to make sure that my stitches are nice and neat and even. If my stitches are too far apart, as you know, you'll have some of your stuffing come out. So I'm making sure they're pretty close together. And I'm just going to stitch until I get all the way down to the end. Now that I'm finished stitching, just a reminder, I have to make my knot to anchor it. I can't just cut it. If I just cut it, all my stitches will come out, my stuffing will come out. So now I'm going to take my needle and I'm doing the airplane trick. I'm going underneath the last stitch. My airplane is taking off. Before it flies away completely, it realizes it forgot to pick up the loop. Go back, pick up the loop, and pull. Remember, this needs to be done twice. So pick up the stitch, take off, turn around, and pick up the loop and pull. Complete. So I'm going to go ahead and snip this off. Take the thread out of this and throw this away. Make sure to put my needle right back immediately so that nobody gets hurt. And now I'm going to take out my pins. I don't need them anymore. And I'm going to give my monster a flip. Flip it over to the back. And you can see there's a little bit of a gap right here because I had to push the stuffing down to sew. So I'm going to give my monster a little bit of a back massage. Oh, monster-likey. And done. Flip him back around. And I can now go back. If I have any spots where there is part sticking out, I'm going to use my glue and just peel that back and press it down. If I wanted to get a little fancy and added anything like toenails or a little glint in the eye, I could use not only more felt but also a little bit of puffy paint. But puffy paint is just for accents, so if you do that, you'd only want to be using a little bit. All right, my monsters are now complete. So as you're beginning to think about your monster, think about all of the different things that you can do to make your monster really fun, creative, and unique, just like you.